Afternoon all, let's have a look at another interesting Garry Kasparov game against one of his great predecessors, Boris Spassky, who of course lost to Bobby Fischer in the 1972 World Championship match. But fast forwarding to 1981, the Tilburg tournament, which by the way is such a special tournament that a chess font is named after it, same with Linares. In the Tilburg series of events, it's interesting that Garry Kasparov has won several of them, about 5. His domination is evident, whilst Kasparov's, I think, domination of Linares is more evident as a series. Okay, so Kasparov playing white against Spassky plays d4, and Spassky plays knight f6, and after c4 we have c5. So we enter into a Benoni type structure soon, potentially. So after knight c3, d6. If it's going to be modern Benoni, it will be this pawn exchanging for d5, and we have a modern Benoni structure proper. But at the moment, it's just Benoni territory, I believe. So after castles, bishop g5. But no, actually, e6 is not used here. Instead, there's a very enterprising, ambitious move played by Boris. He plays b5, which might have been a bit unsettling for Garry Kasparov, who was around 17, 18 at this time, 1981. So Kasparov, he takes the pawn. Okay, here's a pawn up. He holds on to it here on b5. So what compensation does black have for the sacrificed pawn? If white can reinforce b5, and maybe even rook a3 to stop the rook being a liability on the a file, would this be a solid pawn up? Okay, queen a5. The queen might have the intention in some variations of being annoying with either queen b4 or the option of taking and maybe a1 being vulnerable. Okay, so bishop d2 was played, and now knight bd7. Rook a3, securing a bit more the rook, protected by the pawn now. Bishop b7, and now we see some pressure on d5 and e6. After knight f3, black takes. And now bishop takes, queen c7. So it looks like a bit of a dodgy Benko gambit. Okay, where is black's compensation? After castles, knight g4, at least black enjoys the dark squares, like e5 here. Bishop g5. Funny enough though, after this move, there's a prompt for the knight to come back where it came from. Knight goes back here. Okay, knight d2, and it looks as though the painful c4, classic c4 square, is being used to put pressure on d6. After e6, which does mean more pressure on white centre, knight c4 is played. After ed, we do have that classic modern Benoni structure, which is thought to be very unsound, or relatively unsound compared to more solid openings. But of course, Fischer used the Benoni in the 1972 match. It does have dynamism for black, and also of course Tao was a very fond exponent of the Benoni structure. Rook ad8, and now white pushes the extra pawn, maybe quite confidently. After h6, bishop h4. Now again enjoying the use at least of the e5 square. And if white dares to take, then there's going to be a lot of pressure on d5. That will justify the rook on d8. So Kasparov pushes his a pawn confidently, bishop a8. And now rook e1. Okay, and now g5, kicking the bishop to g3. Now knight fd7, which makes way for some possibilities like f5, f4 potentially. And in fact, this is what happens now. a7, f5. Threatening immediately to trap the poor bishop on g3. And it's here Kasparov, he gave up his dark square bishop. Maybe he could consider tucking it away with a move like f3 and maybe putting it on f2 potentially. But it's giving black a seemingly dangerous space advantage anyway. So this forcing move was chosen here. Bishop takes e5, giving up the dark square bishop. So can actually black use this trump card bishop? Because white hasn't got a dark square bishop now. Can these dark squares be used? It's a classic trait of the Benoni system that often the e file and the dark square complex is important to black to make use of. Knight takes e5, and now d takes e5, getting rid of that weak pawn and putting pressure on d5. But Kasparov has the idea now, a concrete idea of rook a6. So there's some concrete ideas emerging here, like d6 and bishop c4. But Boris is not too afraid. He plays e4, liberating further his bishop across the diagonal. And we see bishop c4 immediately threatening to win the queen, of course, with check. Okay, queen f7 just basically pins the pawn to the bishop here. d6 just take the bishop. Knight b5. Okay, so now in this position, king h7. Okay, and Garry now plays rook e6. Rook e6. And this looks to be a very dangerous, rook move in the center of Black's position. Okay. Here, Boris plays queen b7, and it looks as though, yes, he's not doing that well in certain aspects of the position, but this bishop is liberated on the dark squares. These pawns are potentially weak. This diagonal could be interesting one day, potentially. There is pressure on b5 at least. This pawn's not going anywhere. It's blockaded at the moment. So is it a bit tricky, this position, to handle? Well, there is Black's king safety as well, and Kasparov pounces in with queen h5. Okay, so to parry queen g6 is rook f6. Well, among other things, rook f6 is chosen. Kasparov takes this now. Maybe he's a bit wary of taking a potential for e3, maybe. That battery on the diagonal might be dangerous. So rook takes f6, bishop takes f6. Now a curious move, which maybe can't be taken lightly, g4, which potentially weakens White's king across the diagonal. If only Black could use it, though, concretely. But, okay. In this position, f4 is played, and there's an implication of a positional sacrifice here. If rook takes e4, maybe rook takes d5, stripping away the diagonal, possibly. But let's do a forensic examination a little bit later on the second pass through the game. That might be the idea. White plays now h4. Okay, king g7, so that there's two options to take on g5 on hg. Okay, knight c3, and now e4 is really under fire again from two pieces. Can White take this very comfortably without allowing Black any counterplay across this diagonal? Well, Boris plays e3 now, piercing into White's dark squares. But he's weakening, of course, his own squares now, on g6 in particular, and that's highlighted with bishop d3. But e takes f, the king's drawn into the fire a little bit now. Queen takes b2, check, and there's a knight loose now on c3 as well. A piece sacrifice. What is Kasparov doing here, you might wonder? Well, he's got queen g6 in mind. So rook e2, queen takes c3. He's got the very powerful looking queen g6. Okay, it's a piece sacrifice. Queen takes h6 check. Bishop g7. Queen takes g5. Hitting the rook. Has White got enough for this? Whereas rook and queen and bishop look dangerous, as well as these pawns, which Kasparov considers if they get near to the opponent's king, they act like pieces. Okay, Boris has to defend against the pressure. He plays queen f6, not minding the exchange of queens here. Kasparov plays queen takes f6. Okay, has he got enough? Because he is a bishop down here. Bishop c4. Losing the h4 pawn now. King f3. He might have been in severe time pressure at this part of the game. Rook d7. Okay, he clings on to the a pawn, but giving Black the option to cling on to f4. King e4 is the king coming on a dangerous route here. But Black is bishop up, surely. Rook a5, king g7, taking another pawn. Is there enough compensation? Two pawns for the bishop here. King f6. Rook c8 looks very dangerous, but a7 is dropping. Check. King g7. And it looks like, really, this looks now Very, very bad for white. Isn't he just a bishop down in this position? Bishop b7, check. And now, of course, there's an immediate threat. Bishop takes d5, taking the rook. So that's king steps out of the way. But bishop h4, and this pawn looks very dangerous as the passed pawn goes. d6, check. And now bishop e4. Of course, the bishop's now protecting a7, so this is possible. Rook e7. This looks now completely lost for Kasparov. He plays check. And now this pawn can be safely stopped. Isn't black just the bishop up? You might wonder. The bishop b6 stops the king on its adventure on the queen side. Bishop d7. Bishop e8. Another pawn is pushed. Check. After bishop b5, in this position, the bishop has no time to take on e8. Boris just plays f2, and Kasparov resigns. Now, I get the impression from Kasparov's notes to this game that he, as though he was completely won. Kasparov was very, very strong at the time of this game, and Spassky clearly was still very, very strong several years after the 1972 match. I just wonder, maybe Kasparov is uncomfortable playing some of his great predecessors, and especially if the results doesn't go his way. His notes were not that complimentary of Boris's chances after the opening, where he seemed to be just a clear pawn down, and as though Boris was confidently playing on as if nothing had happened. But let's look forensically. I guess engines will definitely like White's position. It looked like a bit of a dodgy Benko gambit in some respects, but nevertheless, Kasparov himself, when qualifying to play Karpov for the World Championship, had often played very dynamically with b5 pawn sacrifices himself in several games as part of his King's Indian defence ideas. So it's a common idea to generate counterplay to hit White c4 with a later b5, even if it's not strictly Benko gambit territory. The principle of generating counterplay is evident with b5. Engines won't like it. They'll reject this move, I guess, outright. This move b5 is slightly outrageous. Okay, but okay, c takes a6. It's not a huge evaluation here on a certain depth for White, though. It goes a bit up after queen a5. Okay, bishop d2. We see a small, well, to big advantage potentially, more than half a pawn. Okay, but nevertheless, it looks like a position you can have fun with black, as long as you don't get your queen trapped. So bishop b7. So he took on b5, queen c7, and he played with that e5 square. So curious incident here. Bishop g5. You might think, well, why did the knight go back here? Let's have a quick look at this. Is knight gf6 the best humble retreat? If knight ge5, if that is possible, that would be interesting to consider. If takes here, take. Now g takes is because of the queen takes, there's knight e5, springing double attack on the bishop. That's better for black. But in this position, maybe this has been evaluated more closely, that this is not too hot for black. But it's strange, this humble retreat knight gf6. If that was forced, it seems the engines like knight ge5 just carry on more consistently actually with the plan. If knight takes and then f4, does it win the pawn here? Bit of compensation. We'll throw in a check. We'll take, and then rook takes e4. Maybe it's not so bad. But anyway, Boris's move looks like a defeatist, in some way, defeatist kind of retreat back from where it came from after the knight gf6. But anyway, let's go on. So this is the classic maneuver in the Benoni, to hit d6. Try and discourage black from playing e6. If black's fully discouraged from playing e6, this diagonal will never be blasted. Never see action. So Boris goes for it. He goes for it. He breaks up the centre. He goes to liberate this diagonal. So knight c4 takes, and now he wants to play knight e5 without d6 being a problem and d5 being exposed. So rook ad8 prepares this idea of knight e5 for the use of d-file and pressure on d5. Okay, there's a small matter that white has this outside passed pawn which he can start pushing forward. Okay, and it does also give the resource rook a6 pretty soon once the pawn goes to a7, as we see. But this is active play on the king side in the spirit of Benoni and attacking chess in general. Okay, was this necessary? The loss of the dark squared bishop here. I think f3 does look too passive, and I think black will be getting sufficient compensation. In fact, okay, engines like white at +2 here, but let's have a look at is f3 actually a terrible move? f4, no, even here, okay. It looks as though taking on e5 technically is a very good idea, with either knight or bishop. And then taking again technically is a good idea. And again, technically, in this position, rook a6 is a good idea. It does support d6, so we're talking nearly +3 from an engine point of view, but we're playing humans in these games. From an engine point of view, it's +3. So why didn't Kasparov put him away if it was so huge? Well, he must have blundered somewhere, technically. He's got that big pawn, so maybe a slight inaccuracy here, that d6 might be stronger than bishop c4. Okay. So again here, maybe a slight inaccuracy, queen b3 might be stronger than knight b5. But where was there, a concrete way of blowing black away? So in the continuation we saw, this is very interesting now, this g4 undermining black's centre. And we saw, and I promised to investigate, I wanted to investigate, this idea that why couldn't white take on d5? I suspected rook d5 only chance. There seems to be a little bit of a shift back, but f3, and maybe there's nothing. So the exchange set doesn't have to be taken. If it is taken, I think that does spell big trouble, doesn't it? For white, or no? Not necessarily. Even here, hg, let's say hg, knight c3. Big advantage to white. Okay. So, anyway, so Kasparov, where did he blunder? It seems knight c3 is the turning point, the big turning point, where he accumulated the big advantage. He had advantage technically. But now this, e3, is a Houdini recommended move, which Boris played here to generate some chances. He's inviting positively bishop d3. What happens if white would take? Then queen takes b2, and this is dangerous now, surely. What does white do here? Knight e2, queen d2? Looks pretty nasty. So, okay, so after this knight c3, I mean b2 is exposed, and it just closes up that e-file temporarily as well. Playing e3, where b2 is still exposed after that knight retreat to c3. So here it looks as though bishop d3 is a recommended move. There's not much. Okay, knight e4 instead. Queen b4 apparently is a good move, double attacking e1 and c4. If rook c1, then the danger, e2, and then again if bishop c4, there's queen takes e4. So black's got some counterplay here. So in the game, yeah, this looks dangerous here for black. Was it actually worth a piece? Technically, what Kasparov did. Let's just further investigate here. Check. So the piece sack. Apparently black is doing okay now. Black has the advantage finally, technically. White gets these pawns. But after queen f6, okay, that's technically inferior to... No, it's okay. And black's okay now. If he can sort of consolidate here, he is bishop up. This move, bishop c4, giving up h4 is curious. But otherwise there's bishop d4 if, say, g5, which is check. So white is starting to lose material. Black is technically doing very well now. In white, taking c5 a7 is was it possible to take on a7 here? Yes, it was, but instead king f6 was chosen. Okay, and instead of just protecting the pawn again, which allows a seemingly dangerous check, where black's only slightly better here, apparently, but I suspect this pawn is more than what the engine is factoring in here. Instead of protecting the pawn, Kasparov gives it up, and it looks as though, you know, really he's just the bishop down now. It's just a matter of consolidating here. So check, bishop e4, powerful move. I think black is just a bishop down. I suspect there's a big advantage technically, that there's no real white chance now. Well, from a certain point here, black was just clearly winning. So out of inertia maybe, Kasparov had been carrying on. In position f2, he's just winning a huge advantage. So if the game continued with bishop takes e8, just queening, there's no time for any, there's no check or anything. Well, it's all over. Just check, whatever, queen e1. It's all over. So, okay, that was a classic Tilburg clash, complicated game, very complicated game, where Kasparov generated counterplay basically. White did technically have a winning advantage, as Kasparov suspected, but he went wrong at a certain point, and he let Spassky in. I think the key moment was e3, the move e3 being underestimated when the knight retreat. So knight c3 was the suspect blunder, I believe. Otherwise white had a big advantage in this position. I think, just to recap here again, so something like d6 looks like a powerful move, just keeping the queen out of b2. Okay, and if e3, just f3. So the queen can never take on f3 because there's a mate in 3. Can't ever take on f3. So this diagonal's not so hot, this position. And is black actually crumbling from here? It is +7. So let's see how black actually concretely would crumble. So hg, use of knight c7 interferes with black's protection of his king. So he can give up b2 here and just get his resources in for the attack. Check. Okay, maybe just taking here on knight e6 now. Or anything now, knight takes, yeah. So he should have really crashed through there on Spassky's king. So, but he let Spassky in, knight c3. At the end of the day in the tournament, actually, both players, Garry Kasparov and Boris Spassky, I think they both scored 5.5. I think the winner was Belyavsky that year in 1981. Kasparov, in later years, there was a huge gap actually before he returned, it seems, from the wiki article on the Tilburg series of tournaments. So you can go and see the winners, and yeah, but when he did, you know, many years later he came in and he won it once or twice. Then it changed into a knockout format. So interesting though that Karpov was really the most dominant player, it seems, of the Tilburg series of events. And maybe, you know, we should check out some of Karpov's triumphs in Tilburg. That would be very interesting, I think. Comments or questions on YouTube? Thanks very much.